Elias Rodriguez, koji je uhapšen kao jedini osumnjičeni za smrtonosnu pucnjavu u kojoj su ubijena 2 zaposlenika izraelske ambasade ispred Jevrejskog muzeja u Vašingtonu, optužen je na Saveznom sudu za dvostruko ubistvo prvog stepena. Navodi se da je Rodriguez smatrao da se jedino oružanim napadima može skrenuti pažnja na ono što se dešava u Gazi. 29 djece i starih osoba umrlo je od uzroka povezanih s glađu posljednjih nekoliko dana u Gazi. Blokada za koju Izrael tvrdi da je uvedena kako bi se izvršio pritisak na Hamas da oslobodi više talaca, široko je doživljena kao kolektivno kažnjavanje civilnog stanovništva Gaze i kršenje međunarodnih prava. Administracija Donalda Trumpa ukinula je Univerzitetu Harvard ovlaštenje za upis stranih studenata. Gotovo 6800 stranih studenata sada mora preći na druge fakultete ili napustiti Sjedinjene Države. Pjevačica Cassie Ventura svjedočila je protiv Diddyja na suđenju u New Yorku, optužujući ga za višegodišnje zlostavljanje, seksualnu eksploataciju i psihološku kontrolu kroz ucjene i nasilje. Analiziramo nasilje u privatnim vezama i položaj žrtava sa nekadašnjom savjetnicom pri Ujedinjenim nacijama Dušijan Pisači. Dvoje članova osoblja izraelske ambasade u Vašingtonu, izraelski državljanin Jaron Ličinski i Amerikanka Sarah Milgram ubijeni su u srijedu na večer. Dok su napuštali događaj u Jevrejskom muzeju, par je, prema riječima izraelskog ambasadora, bio na korak do vjeridbe. U trenutku hapšenja osumnjičeni je uzvikivao parole Free Free Palestine. Potvrdila je to američka policija. Pucnjava se dogodila ispred Capitol Jewish Museum ubrzo nakon završetka godišnjeg prijema za mlade diplomate u organizaciji American Jewish Committee. Prema izjavama očevidaca, napadač je prethodno viđen kako nervozno hoda ispred muzeja, zatim je prišao grupi ljudi i otvorio vatru. Nakon toga je ušao u muzej gdje su ga zadržali pripadnici obezbjeđenja. Policija je identificirala osumnjičenog kao Eliasa Rodrigueza, 31 godinu, iz Chicaga. Motiv napada još se istražuje, ali vlasti navode da je slučaj pod istragom zbog mogućeg političkog ekstremizma. Ovaj tragični događaj dolazi u trenutku intenzivne izraelske vojne ofanzive na pojas Gaze i rastuće međunarodne napetosti, uključujući sve učestale izvještaje o antisemitskim incidentima. Izraelske misije širom svijeta odmah su pojačale bezbjednosne mjere, a zastave su spuštene na pola koplja u znak žalosti.
Our community today is reeling as a result of one person's actions. 2 families now are left to grieve for dreams that will never be realized. And as I speak right now, there is an individual who is being presented in court and charged with various crimes. 31-year-old Elias Rodriguez of Chicago, Illinois, is now charged by complaint after his initial appearance before U.S. Magistrate Judge Matthew Sharbaugh with the following: murder in the first degree for the murder of 30-year-old Yaron Levshinsky, a foreign official and official guest of the United States. Mr. Levshinsky was here on official business for the State of Israel. The defendant Rodriguez is also charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree for both Yaron Leshimsky along with 26-year-old Sarah Lynn Milgram of Kansas. In addition, there are several felony firearms charges for discharging a firearm in the middle of a violent crime and for causing the death of an individual through the use of that firearm. Let me also say that violence against anyone based on their religion is an act of cowardice. It is not an act of a hero. It is the kind of case that we will vigorously pursue. Anti-Semitism will not be tolerated, especially in the nation's capital. Now, we're going to continue to investigate this as a hate crime and a crime of terrorism. And we will add additional charges as the evidence warrants.
And I'd like to start by reiterating what Director Patel pushed out publicly that the tragic murder of these two Israeli embassy employees outside of the Capitol Jewish Museum last night was both an act of terror and directed violence against the Jewish community, and it has the full and unwavering attention of the FBI. The FBI Washington Field Office, JTTF, has been in lockstep with MPD, and with the assistance of FBI offices across the country, we're continuing to investigate and contact the subject's associates, his family members, and co-workers. We are also executing search warrants for his electronic devices, reviewing his social media accounts, and all of his internet postings.
Iz Chicago uključujem kolegu, s nama je Antonije Kovačević, dopisnik Newsmax Balkans. Antonije, nalazimo se u trenutku dubokih tenzija. Kako je američka javnost, a posebno čikaška zajednica, reagovala na vijest da je osumnjičen za ovaj dvostruki zločin upravo iz njihovog grada? I šta znamo do sada?
Chicago je u šoku kao i cela Amerika. Ovo što se desilo kasno sinoć nije običan zločin, jer su žrtve dvoje diplomata jedne zemlje koja se nalazi u ratnom sukobu i Amerika je od sinoć izvanično postala još jedan front onoga što gledamo u Palestini i Gazi. Da tragedija bude veća na ovom događaju posle koga je usledio ovaj teroristički akt gdje su ubijena dva člana osoblja izraelske ambasade, događaj je bio humanitarnog karaktera i na njemu se prikupljalo pomoć upravo za one najugroženije u Gazi. Da je u pitanju zločin iz političkih razloga svedoči i činjenica, tačnije izjave očevidaca, da je napadač mirno sačekao nakon zločina policiju i njima saopštio da sve to što je uradio, da je uradio upravo zbog onoga što se dešava u Gazi. On je kasnije i po policijskim izveštajima uzvikivao parole Slobodna Palestina dok su ga privodili za vreme koje je bio u pritvoru.
Da li se zna više sada o sumnjičenom Eliasu Rodriguezu, njegovoj prošlosti, potencijalnim vezama, možda sa političkim organizacijama? Da li je on djelovao sam ili šta znamo o eventualnim psihološkim problemima? Šta kaže američka vlada, šta kažu američki zvaničnici koji su izašli pred medije do sada?
Pa ono što mi za sada znamo jeste samo da je pomenuti Rodriguez iz Čikaga, da je živeo u stanu sa ženom za koju se za sada ne zna da li mu je supruga. Komšije za njega kažu da je bio miran, povučen čovek. Oni koji su imali prilike s njim da razmene koju reč kažu da nikada nije razgovarao o politici. Nema ga u policijskim dosijejima. FBI i čikaška policija u međuvremenu su bili na mestu na adresi na kojoj je Rodriguez živeo. Za sada nemamo nikakve detalje da su oni našli išta sporno. Ono što znamo, zapravo što se pretpostavlja i što FBI tek istražuje, to je pismo koje je objavljeno na jednom profilu na društvenoj mreži X, za koje se sumnja da je njegov autor upravo Rodriguez. U tom pismu se navodi da je ovo što je on počinio, dakle, ubistvo i oružani incidenti, da su jedini način da se stavi do znanja i da se skrene pažnja na ono što se dešava u Gazi i Palestini.
Kako ovaj događaj može odjeknuti? Kako odjekuje u diplomatskim političkim krugovima u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama s obzirom na to da su žrtve bile direktno povezane sa izraelskom ambasadom, dakle članovi osoblja izraelske ambasade, ali i radom izraelske ambasade u Sjedinjenim Državama? I šta ovo može učiniti za momentum koji je Gaza stekla da se sva pomoć, dakle humanitarna, ipak uveze i preveze do civila?
Koliko će to uticati na humanitarnu pomoć, za sada ne možemo da govorimo. Trump je naravno danas razgovarao sa Benjaminom Netanjahuom, izrazio svoje žaljenje i saučešće i rekao da zločini koji kao osnovu imaju antisemitizam moraju hitno prestati. Država američka je obećala da će istraga i da će ono što predstoji u sudskom procesu biti definitivno dokaz da je američka država usmerena ka tome da suzbije antisemitizam u bilo kom obliku. Izraelski ambasador u Vašingtonu je izjavio nešto što je po meni vrlo sporno. On je naime Rodriguezov čin, za njegov čin rekao da ne postoje informacije da je vezan konkretno za sukobe u Gazi. Istina je da Rodriguez svakako nije Palestinac, ali očigledno da je izraelski ambasador promašio temu kada je rekao da ovo što se desilo nema veze sa sukobom u Gazi. To je okretanje glave, zatvaranje očiju, ne znam kako to drugačije da nazovem. Svakako da ima veze sa onim što se dešava u Gazi i svakako da će i posledice biti velike, međutim čini se da taj sudski proces koji će uslediti ili možda pooštravanje neke politike, što je također sekretarka za štampu Caroline Leavitt koja je rekla da će pooštriti politiku prema studentskim kampusima, prema univerzitetima zapravo koji u svojim kampusima dozvoljavaju delovanje tih pro-palestinskih trupa. Ona je danas naglasila da su one praktično izvor antisemitizma i da će državna administracija, da će Trumpov kabinet obustaviti, kao što je već najavljeno, znamo, razgovarali smo o tome, obustaviti pomoć koju je država do sada davala univerzitetima poput Harvarda i nekih drugih, a koji su se sada praktično našli na crnoj listi, i verujem da će ovaj događaj poslednji još više uticati na tu odluku Trumpovu, gde on smatra da jednim udarcem praktično ubija dve muve, osim što se bori protiv kako on to kaže, semitističkih grupa, on suzbija i legla liberalne politike, jer se zna da na tim fakultetima među profesorima i studentima uglavnom su oni koji ne podržavaju ni njegovu politiku, a u proteklom periodu su bili apsolutno protiv svih maltene njegovih političkih odluka.
Izrael je optužio zemlje članice Evropske unije da su poslale zapaljive retorike, uključujući i Veliku Britaniju, da su poslale zapaljive retorike, antisemitske retorike u svijet. Francuska je odmah odbila da je to slučaj i rekla da apsolutno nije ni u kojem slučaju pokušala nahuškati bilo koje ekstremiste na antisemitska djelovanja. Koliko ovaj slučaj dodatno komplikuje već zapaljivu situaciju u vezi sa sukobom u Gazi?
Pa videli smo kakva je bila reakcija na tu izjavu francuskog ministra spoljnih poslova. On je demantovao i rekao da je to preterano. Međutim, meni ovo sve liči i kako se stvari dalje odvijaju, znamo prethodno iz pregovora o ratu u Ukrajini, da sve dobija jednu novu podelu na koju nismo imali prilike da gledamo u prošlosti. Očigledno da se Amerika i Izrael svrstavaju kao saveznici na jednu stranu, Evropa je izolovana kao posebna celina koja više nema tako jake i bliske veze sa američkom administracijom kao što je imala do januara meseca i do prestanka mandata Joea Bidena. I u pregovorima o miru u Ukrajini videli smo da Amerika pokušava na sve načine da skrajne Evropu iz tog procesa, dok se Zelenski trudi da grčevito se drži za Evropljane koji mu izgleda još jedini daju nekakvu podršku u ratu sa Rusijom. Kako će ta nova globalna podela uticati i da li će Trump odustati ili se naprotiv potruditi da ono što je obećao u svojoj predizbornoj kampanji, a to je da će uspostaviti mir u Palestini, mir u Gazi. Sećamo se onih propagandnih spotova gde Gaza liči na nekakav veliki marketinški cirkus sa oblakodarima, sa tržnim centrima i hotelima. Od toga se ništa nije desilo. Svedoci smo da u Gazi svakoga dana ginu ljudi, svedoci smo toga da je i ona jedina bolnica koja je funkcionisala u međuvremenu bombardovana od strane izraelske vojske. Očekivati da se stvari smire i da se taj neki revolt prema delovanju države Izrael stiša ili da se naprotiv ugasi nekakvim metodama sile, a da ne proizvede opet povratne neke reakcije, mislim da je sumanuto i mislim da takva politika ne vodi ničemu osim daljem krvoproliću.
Da, i podjelama. Evo za kraj samo, Antonije, da li se u Čikagu preduzimaju bilo kakve mjere sigurnosti, posebno u jevrejskim institucijama, nakon što je osumnjičeni identifikovan kao lokalni stanovnik?
Pa i ja za sada nemam takve informacije, imam te informacije za Washington, u bliskim sam kontaktima sa izraelskom zajednicom ovde u Čikagu i od njih nisam dobio informacije da su njihovi verski objekti, njihov muzej holokausta koji se nalazi ovde u neposrednoj blizini mesta odakle vam se javljam, da su dobili nekakve pojačane mere obezbeđenja. U Vašingtonu se to već dešava i izraelska ambasada i institucije jevrejskog naroda i države Izrael su dobile dodatno obezbeđenje i od strane američkih organa vlasti, a i pojačano je obezbeđenje agenata Mosada. Verujem da će u Čikagu uslediti nešto slično, mada se u Čikagu apsolutno ne postoji ta neka atmosfera, da kažem, da postoji to neko antisemitističko delovanje, barem ne na nekom organizovanom nivou.
Dobro. Antonije, hvala ti mnogo za ovaj izvještaj za sada. Svakako pratimo situaciju i svjedočenje osumnjičenog pred sudom. Ostani svakako uz nas i ovih dana da popratimo situaciju. Bio ovo naš dopisnik iz Čikaga, Antonije Kovačević. Ostanite uz nas. Ministar zdravstva palestinske samouprave Radman rekao je da je 29 djece i starih osoba umrlo od uzroka povezanih s glađu u posljednjih nekoliko dana u Gazi. Blokada za koju Izrael tvrdi da je uvedena kako bi se izvršio pritisak na Hamas da oslobodi više talaca, široko je doživljena kao kolektivno kažnjavanje civilnog stanovništva Gaze i kršenje međunarodnih humanitarnih i ljudskih prava. Predsjednik Palestinskog crvenog polumjeseca izjavio je da se mnogi kamioni i dalje nalaze na granici na prelazu Karim Shalom. Prije rata prosječno je u Gazu svakodnevno ulazilo oko 500 kamiona i dalje postoje ozbiljni nedostaci osnovnih prehrambenih namirnica i prenapuhane cijene, dok medicinari upozoravaju da se pothranjenost širi teritorijom.
Gaza faces the worst humanitarian crisis since the commencement of hostilities following the attacks of October 7th, 2023, with civilians facing starvation and being at critical risk of famine, according to the IPC, and with hundreds of aid workers having been killed since the conflict began. In Sudan, civilians bear the brunt of violence, with millions internally displaced and over half of the population facing high levels of acute food insecurity. Widespread civilian suffering was also reported in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, Mozambique, Myanmar, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, the Syrian Arab Republic, Ukraine, and elsewhere. This cannot continue. Today, we come with one clear message. The protection of civilians is not optional. It is a legal obligation under international humanitarian law and a moral imperative we cannot afford to neglect.
The scaffolding built last century to protect us from inhumanity is crumbling. Those who will die as a result need us to act. Mr. President, last year, the United Nations recorded more than 36,000 civilian deaths in 14 armed conflicts. The real number is, I fear, much higher. Some parties to conflict have committed flagrant violations of the rules of law. Some have justified immense civilian harm through permissive interpretations of the law, loosely defining who is a lawful target, what constitutes a military objective, or what level of civilian harm is proportional.
Airstrikes increased after the devastating...
Some states consider the law selectively, depending on the parties concerned or the interests at stake. All this undermines the very purpose of the rules of war, to limit human suffering in armed conflict. All this jeopardizes the protection architecture that took decades to build. There is, though, another path, provided that this Council and Member States take action to salvage what they have built.
In war, women and girls are not just caught in the crossfire. They, their bodies, their health, their choices, and their voices are actively targeted. Conflict-related sexual violence is a protection crisis that rightfully warrants its own attention. For women and girls, this meant... Across too many conflicts, women's bodies become battlegrounds through sexual violence and also through the deliberate denial of reproductive rights and health services. 61% of all maternal deaths occur in just 35 conflict-affected countries. In the past year, we have seen bombed maternity wards, blockaded medical supplies, and massive funding cuts.
Izraelske snage izvele su u četvrtak niz zračnih napada na više lokacija na jugu Libana, uključujući i regije daleko od granice, izvijestila je to libanska državna agencija NNA. Napadi su opisani kao najsnažniji u pojedinim područjima od sklapanja primirja u novembru, kojim je okončan posljednji sukob između Izraela i Hezbolaha. Stanovnici sjevernog Izraela prijavili su glasne eksplozije s druge strane granice, a za sada nema informacija o žrtvama. Izrael svakodnevno izvodi napade na teritoriju Libana od kako je primirje stupilo na snagu, dok libanske vlasti tvrde da su ti napadi kršenje dogovora. Izraelska strana navodi da cilja Hezbolah kako bi spriječila njegovo ponovno naoružanje. Eskalacija sukoba izaziva zabrinutost zbog mogućeg širenja nasilja u regiji. Na ceremoniji Ivors u Londonu Bono je pozvao na mir i zaštitu humanitarnih radnika u Gazi, dok je YouTube primio prestižnu Ivors Academy Fellowship nagradu. Govoreći na sceni, Bono je rekao: Hamas, oslobodite taoce, zaustavite rat, a Izrael, oslobodite se od Netanjahua i desničarskih fundamentalista. Svi zaštitite naše humanitarce i medicinske radnike, oni su najbolji među nama. YouTube je prvi irski autor koji su postali članovi ove elitne grupe uz imena poput Paula McCartneya i Kate Bush. Charlie XCX proglašena je autoricom godine, dok su i Robbie Williams, Block Party i Brandon Flowers nagrađeni za svoje karijere.
Peace creates possibilities in the most intractable situations. And Lord knows there's a few of them out there right now. Hamas, release the hostages. Stop the war. Israel, be released from Benjamin Netanyahu and the far-right fundamentalists that twist your sacred texts. All of you, protect our aid workers. They are the best of us. God, you must be so tired of us, children of Abraham, in the rubble of our certainties. Children in the rubble of our revenge. God, forgive us. I'm going to sing this now, if I can find a microphone.
Američki predsjednik Donald Trump ponovno se oglasio o uvođenju carina, te je najavio kako će ova mjera prema Evropskoj uniji stupiti na snagu 1. juna. U ovom osvrtu na društvenoj mreži Trump je rekao kako se je vrlo teško nositi s Evropskom unijom. Njihove moćne trgovinske barijere, PDV, smiješne korporativne kazne, nemonetarne trgovinske barijere, monetarne manipulacije, nepravedne i neopravdane tužbe protiv američkih kompanija dovele su do trgovinskog deficita sa Sjedinjenim državama, vrijednim više od $250.000, što je neprihvatljivo, zbog čega preporučujem direktnu carinu od 50%, poručio to Trump. Administracija Donalda Trumpa ukinula je Univerzitetu Harvard ovlaštenje za upis stranih studenata, optužujući ga za stvaranje nesigurnog okruženja i saradnju s kineskom komunističkom partijom. Gotovo 6.800 stranih studenata sada mora preći na druge univerzitete ili napustiti Sjedinjene Američke Države. Harvard ovu odluku naziva nezakonitom i tvrdi da ugrožava akademsku misiju i sigurnost međunarodne zajednice na kampusu. Harvard sada tuži Trumpa. Colin Binkley, The Associated Press.
The Trump administration revoked Harvard University's ability to host foreign students on their campus. They said that any of the university's more than 6,000 foreign students either needs to transfer to another university or they will lose their status to be in the country legally. This is part of the Trump administration's escalating battle with Harvard. Harvard is the first university in the United States to openly defy the Trump administration's orders to limit pro-Palestinian protests on campus and to eliminate DEI practices. And this is one more front that the administration is looking at to kind of try to pressure Harvard into coming into compliance. The Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security had requested a bunch of documents from Harvard related to international students. She says that Harvard didn't comply, and as a result, she's taking this step to revoke Harvard's ability to host foreign students on campus. She says that if they comply with a records request within 72 hours, they could regain that status. But for now, they're telling students that they're no longer eligible to be at Harvard and that they would need to transfer or leave the country. Harvard said that this is unlawful. They said that they're working as quickly as they can to get answers to students about how they can stay on campus. And they said that it's one more example of retaliation from the Trump administration. In her letter to Harvard, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem said that this does send a message to other universities that they need to comply. So I think this does send a message that the administration would at least consider doing something like this in other cases. This has not happened to any other university at this point. Harvard has faced a lot of the brunt of this administration's pressure, but certainly other universities are worried.
Pjevačica Cassie Ventura, bivša partnerica Seana Diddyja Combsa, dala je potresno svjedočenje na suđenju koje se održava u Yorku optužujući muzičkog mogula za višegodišnje zlostavljanje i kontrolu. Cassie je detaljno opisala kako ju je Combs prisiljavao na sudjelovanje u takozvanim freak-off seksualnim susretima s muškim eskortima koje je on organizirao, finansirao i snimao, često uz upotrebu droge, što ukazuje na obrasce koji se često vežu uz moderne oblike seksualne eksploatacije i trgovine ljudima. Svjedočila je i o fizičkom nasilju, uključujući udarce, prijetnje i psihološku manipulaciju kojom je Combs održavao nadzor nad njom. Navela je da se osjećala zarobljeno, da se bojala za svoju sigurnost i da ju je Combs koristio snimke intimnih trenutaka kao sredstvo ucjene. Ovaj slučaj otvara pitanja ne samo o nasilju u privatnim odnosima, nego i o tome kako se slavni i moćni mogu koristiti svojim položajem za sistemsku eksploataciju uz elemente koji upotpunjuju definiciju seksualnog traffickinga. Suđenje je privuklo golem interes javnosti, a Cassino svjedočenje mogla bi biti ključna tačka u otkrivanju razmjera zlostavljanja u muzičkoj industriji. I'm bringing therapist, former UN consultant on gender-based violence, Dushanti Sachi, on the show. She's joining me from Los Angeles. Dushanti, welcome to Newsmax Balkans, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's really good to have you here. And there is so much to unpack in the Diddy case. And as we can see, public has been somewhat divided on Cassie taking the stand. Now, from psychological standpoint, how can someone appear to be consenting while actually experiencing coercive control, especially in the relationship like the one Cassie described on the stand?
Sure. It's actually much more common than people realize because of a phenomenon called trauma bonding. Unfortunately, because of social media, people tend to not understand what that term means. Trauma bonding does not mean I tell you my trauma, you tell me your trauma. That's what social media says it is. Clinically speaking, trauma bonding is a phenomenon where a victim feels a bond to the abuser who is traumatizing her. And that is a very common phenomenon where they feel love, where they feel loyalty, where they may be brainwashed into thinking certain things are their idea, even though they aren't. And there is actually a neurobiology around this concept as to why this happens. And there's a couple of different things we can talk about to explain that.
Didn't want to disappoint Diddy, and she felt responsible for fulfilling his desires. How does emotional dependency or trauma bonding, like you said yourself, develop in abusive relationship like this one?
Right. So I think for a long time, people didn't understand why trauma bonding was happening, but we knew that it was happening. And they connected it to the inconsistency of the reward and of the sort of approval and the praise. Because in a cycle of abuse, in a violent cycle, which we see in intimate partner violence relationship or what's known as domestic violence, as well as in sex trafficking, there's 4 different phases in the circle. So you have the honeymoon phase, which is sort of like the love bombing, the excessive admiration and gifts and praise, which is used really not as an expression of love, but as a mechanism of control because the person lets their guard down. Then you have a calm phase, then you have the tension building, and then you have the explosive fight. And then what happens is that this cycle continues all over again. We know in the case with Cassie and Sean Combs that there was violence in the relationship. What happens in the brain is that the dopamine levels, which is responsible for pleasure, surges and spikes and then drops. We talk about this a lot right now when we think about addiction. Like, so similar to alcoholics, people say, well, why can't alcoholics just stop drinking? We understand now that an addiction mechanism forms in the brain. It's very similar in cases of people who've been trafficked, as well as people who are in physically abusive relationships. So during the honeymoon phase, this dopamine level spikes and they feel really good. And actually, it also can spike during the conflict phase because they're seeing in studies with rats that during an aggressive incident, the dopamine levels spike. However, during the calm and the tension building phases, as we talked about that cycle, it drops. And the victim becomes in the brain almost like a chemical dependency where they want that spike again, similar to any addiction, similar to slot machines, similar to alcoholism. So they crave it. So when the partner comes back in after the abusive incident with the love bombing, the brain is just so desperate to feel that spike and that high again, that they will enter back into the relationship. And it's a really vicious cycle. The brain likes homeostasis. They like for the levels to remain the same. So it's okay for them to go up and down as long as they can come back to this homeostasis. But in something like abuse and love bombing, they're spiking so high that the brain never gets a chance to get into homeostasis.
Dushyanthy, why do so many victims of sexual exploitation or trafficking delay coming forward, sometimes even for years, which is the case in Cassie's case? And what makes disclosure so difficult, especially in high-profile cases?
Well, there's multiple reasons. So one of them is this trauma bonding, is that there's this chemical dependency on the abuser where they feel this loyalty, where they don't want to turn this person that they think they love, because this chemical spike and low can get confused with love, and they don't want that person to be turned in or get in trouble. And there's also a lot of shame, particularly with intimate partner violence. Is a lot of people who end up in these situations think, I can't believe this is happening to me. I can't believe this is my life. And they're embarrassed to say this is happening. And particularly with something like sex trafficking, where they're doing these sexual acts that they don't feel good about, they're embarrassed to tell people. So the combination between the loyalty, the confusion of what love is, and shame stops the majority of them from coming forward. I think what's so interesting about this case is you see how much miseducation there is around intimate partner violence and trafficking, because people are saying things like, well, why did she stay? Why didn't she come forward? But if you work in this area, or if you're familiar with the subject, you know that that is more often the norm. On average, it takes a victim 18 times to leave before they actually leave an abusive situation. So 18 times means they pack up, they leave, and then something brings them back, right?
Right.
So we see this phenomenon more so than we see someone who's able to just say, okay, this is not good for me, I'm going to leave. It's this high and this low. We know that trauma, physical violence, sexual violence actually can change the brain. We've seen it on MRI scans, and it makes it more difficult for them to get out of this really vicious and dangerous cycle.
And this is exactly what Cassie described. She described feeling confused, scared,
Yes.
but still
Yes.
in love. How do contradictory emotions like fear and affection coexist in abusive dynamics? And what impact does it have on a person's ability to leave or to speak out?
Right. So, and again, I'm someone who's studied these concepts theoretically, but I've also sat in front of countless victims of physical and sexual abuse to hear that this is exactly what most of the victims are saying. They're saying, but I love this person. I'm afraid of this person. So oxytocin is another neurotransmitter, keep in mind. That is the feel-good chemical. That's what we release when we have sex, when we're in a social situation, when we're cuddling. So keep in mind, during the honeymoon phase, all of this oxytocin is getting released. There's most likely sex as part of the makeup from the very same person that's abusing you. So the brain is releasing these chemicals that feel like love. And during the abuse, there could be fear. So all of these things coexist, and it can become very confusing. Not to mention the piece that this addiction, this high and this low, because it's like, I need this, can be confused for love.
Yes, and in this case, there's a clear imbalance of power. Cassie was young, unknown, and dependent on Diddy professionally. How does grooming play out in adult relationships where a victim is emotionally or economically dependent on the abuser himself?
Right. So grooming, yes, exactly. So grooming, we can see grooming is very clear in this situation because you see the age difference. He's 17 years older than him. She was only 19 when they met. And when she met, he's in this powerful position of being the president of the record label she was signed to. So when a predator is grooming a victim, and you see this a lot in abuse cases, but you also see this a lot in the entertainment industry, right? This is what the Me Too movement spoke to, where they're able to sort of coerce, which is part of the legal definition of trafficking. They're coercing them by sort of offering a lavish lifestyle, by offering, promotion of the record or whatever is promised in those moments. But it's sort of a disingenuous behavior where they're coercing them by making these promises and then controlling them and then ultimately becoming physically and often sexually abusive of them. The power dynamic, the age difference, and the fact that the most vulnerable fall victim to this, right? So whether they're economically vulnerable, socially vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable, we don't know what trauma history that she may have had. I think there's a lot of criticism in this case of her that I'm saying I see some support, but a lot of criticism. I think partly because of the lavish lifestyle, right? Mm-hmm. So people are saying, well, she got all this in return. The thing I think people really need to separate is whether or not they have an opinion about some of the choices made in entering the relationship. I think to me, it's very clear that there was a lot of coercion. It doesn't change that he was abusive physically, abusive sexually, and that he controlled and manipulated her. We see that play out through the course of the relationship, where he threatens to release these sex videos if she doesn't behave in the way that she wants him to. She's expressed that she was afraid to not participate in the freak offs because she didn't know what would happen. You can't separate the intimate partner violence from the freak offs,
Yeah.
as they're calling them, right? Like, there's always, for someone who's in an intimate partner violent relationship, there's always a fear of what might happen if I don't do what my partner wants. So a lot of people are alluding to the text where she says, well, I can't wait for the next one. Yeah, because one, she could have been afraid that if she didn't say that, there would be a consequence. And also, there's a brainwashing that happens in the trauma bond through this process, like you were talking about grooming and coercion, where they're saying, the abuser saying, I love you, and you're doing this because you love me. Don't you love this too? And it becomes a very confusing cycle. But when you hear Cassie talk about it now, she says, I felt worthless. I felt like dirt. I didn't feel good about myself. And she did say that she tried to express that to him and he dismissed it. And then she became fearful of what would happen if she stopped.
And given Cassie's public image as a successful singer and Diddy's immense influence at the time, how does the need to maintain those appearances contribute to Cassie's or to victims' silence or even denial of the abuse? Because it took her a long time to come out and say, yes, I was really abused.
I mean, in tremendous ways, right? Because everything is just literally under a magnifying glass. So she's worried what people would think about her as she's trying to build her own career if they find out that she's in an abusive relationship because of the shame involved. And then she's bringing down, quite arguably one of the most powerful men in hip hop and in music. So she's concerned about protecting his public image, her public image. So it's, and the camera's on them all the time. It's not like she ever had a moment where she could feel comfortable, where she could do this in a safe space, right? We always talk about doing trauma disclosure in safe spaces. How is that the case where every time they walk out the door together, there's cameras on them? So there's the magnifying glass of it. And then there's also just like we've discussed, the tangible aspect of what will happen to my career if this powerful person is hurt by what I'm exposing. Now, this is sort of the power dynamic that has allowed Hollywood and music executives to continue to this day to do this to victims, to artists, to talent, because they're so afraid of losing their career, of their financial and professional advancement. If they really say, you see celebrities even as big as Gwyneth Paltrow talking about this. If I disclose this, this is going to hurt my career.
And he used recorded sex acts to blackmail her as well. And she was constantly corrected or intimidated with platitudes like "fix your face." We often hear people ask Dushyanthy, why didn't she leave? But what are the deeper emotional and psychological forces that make leaving a relationship like this not just hard, but terrifying or even dangerous?
Right. So we talked about the trauma bonding. We talked about, the chemical cycles in the brain, the confusion of, do I love this person? But then on top of that, you have the fear, right? So the threat of violence.
Is fear the driving force of everything?
I think it's difficult to say which of these things is the driving force because there's so many factors, which is what makes it so complex. But fear is definitely a driving force, particularly when there's violence involved. And we saw how badly she was beaten by him when she tried to leave one of those freak offs. That hotel incident was her trying to leave a freak off and she literally got beaten for it. And also the blackmailing. I will show this video if you don't step in line. We know that he blackmailed her mother that he would release videos if she didn't give him $20,000, which the mom did, but was then sent back. So blackmailing and threats of violence to her were a big piece of this. And of course, that would cause a huge amount of fear. And then you mentioned the criticism, right? Imagine the toll this takes on a person's self-esteem and confidence, right? The constant criticism, the physical beating, how she felt during the sexual encounters. you need a good amount of strength and confidence to walk out of any relationship, but especially an abusive relationship that has this toxic cycle. So that's another piece of it, is that all of that is getting diminished. And she's talked about now the process of trying to rebuild herself after this. And that makes it very different difficult from a psychological point of view to leave. There's a reason why victims of trafficking and intimate partner violence get trapped.
Dushyanthy, just one last question for you. What do you think, from your standpoint, the outcome of this trial will be?
Right, that's a really great question. I think what they're trying to do, similar to what they did in the R. Kelly case, like he's being accused of three things, right? Of racketeering, so having this business that's supporting these illegal activities, of sex trafficking, and also of transportation for prostitution, flying all these sex workers or dancers or strippers around the world to have sex with her. There is definitely enough evidence to convict him of sex trafficking. And in fact, I spoke yesterday with the director of legal services for Sanctuary for Families, which is the anti-trafficking agency and intimate partner violence agency where I worked when I was living in New York City. And the director, who's a lawyer who fights these cases every day, she said, there's no doubt in my mind that his behavior fits the legal definition for sex trafficking. However, what the defense has done in the last couple days is made the public believe that she was consenting. This is the big question. Was this consent or was this coercion? And this is why conversations like this are so important. There has to be education around, even if the victim appears to be consenting, they are still a victim. They were most likely brainwashed. They're caught in an addiction cycle, the same way that we don't always, we understand that with alcoholics that they may say things and do things that they don't really mean. There has to be more education that this is what's going on with victims. Unfortunately, the defense seemed to have done a good job that she may have been consenting, but by legal definition, the evidence is very clear. The last point I just want to allude to is, and I saw this play out in the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case, you don't have to like her or her behavior to name it as abuse by legal definition, to name it as trafficking. The defense also closed with bringing up the fact that she got a $10 million that there was a case where she got $10 million from the hotel where she was beaten, the whole piece about, the $20 million settlement, $30 million. I think they're doing all this to sort of say, well, she's actually out this for the money. Whether or not you agree with that piece of it, it's within her legal right. And it doesn't change that under the legal and clinical definition, she was physically abused and she was sex trafficked by Sean Combs.
So many factors are going to decide in this case. Dushyanthy, thank you very much for this detailed analysis from a standpoint of a therapist, of a psychologist. It's very important to understand that the victims and why victims don't speak out, like they say, on time. Why didn't she leave? These are all very important questions, and thank you for really joining me here.
Thank you for having me. It's so important, especially in this moment. So thank you.
Thank you. This was therapist, former UN consultant on gender-based violence, Dushyanthy Sachi, who joined me from Los Angeles. Toliko u Pulsu planete za ovu sedmicu. Ove razgovore i informacije možete i dalje potražiti na našem sajtu newsmaxbalkans.com. Do naredne sedmice. Doviđenja.